Welcome back to Quiet Victorian Nights, where gentle stories unfold beneath soft lamplight, quiet villages rest beneath the evening sky, and ordinary lives reveal extraordinary kindness. Before we begin tonight's journey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Now, make yourself as comfortable as you can. Let your shoulders relax. Allow the weight of the day to drift away, one slow breath at a time. There is nowhere you need to be for a little while, and nothing you need to accomplish before sleep arrives. So settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let the peaceful lanes of Victorian England unfold around you. Our story begins. Spring came gently to Bath in the year 1897. The long winter rains had finally given way to clear mornings, and the honey-coloured stone buildings that lined the city's graceful streets seemed to glow warmly beneath the soft April sun. Flower sellers arranged buckets of daffodils and tulips outside their shops. Horses pulled elegant carriages across streets still damp from the night before, and the bells of the parish churches drifted peacefully through the cool air. Bath had always been a city that valued tradition. Families returned to the same baker, the same tailor, the same solicitor, year after year, believing that trust, once earned, should never be hurried away by fashion. Among those trusted names, there was one that had quietly passed from one generation of women to the next for nearly 3 decades. Her name was Eleanor Voss. For 28 years, Eleanor had been one of the most respected midwives in Bath. She had welcomed hundreds of children into the world, first helping young brides become mothers, then, years later, returning to deliver the children of those very babies she had once held in her own hands. Few people outside the city would have recognized her name, but within Bath, there were countless families who could still remember the night Mrs. Voss arrived at their front door, carrying her worn leather case, her dark wool cloak damp with rain or snow, and the quiet confidence that somehow settled every anxious room she entered. It was often said that Eleanor never raised her voice during a birth, and yet no one ever failed to hear her. There was something about her calmness that invited others to borrow it, especially when fear threatened to take hold. On a cool morning in early April, a carriage stopped outside Eleanor's modest house on Henrietta Street, just after sunrise. She was already awake, as she almost always was. Years of being called at every hour of the day and night had taught her never to sleep too deeply. The fire had already been lit in the kitchen. A kettle was beginning to warm above the stove, and her leather medical case sat neatly packed beside the front door, exactly where it had rested every evening for as long as she could remember. Inside were clean linen cloths, folded with careful precision, polished instruments, small glass bottles, fresh bandages, and a blue cloth-bound notebook that accompanied her to every birth she attended. The young footman, standing outside, removed his cap as soon as Eleanor opened the door. "Mrs. Voss," he said politely. "Miss Charlotte Ashcroft's labor began before dawn." Eleanor needed no further explanation. She had visited Charlotte twice during the previous month and knew the young woman was healthy, though understandably nervous about becoming a mother for the first time. She quietly fastened the buttons of her gloves, lifted her leather case, locked the front door behind her, and climbed into the waiting carriage without wasting a single unnecessary moment. After nearly 30 years, preparing for a birth had become less a routine than a rhythm, one her hands remembered long before she ever needed to think about it. The journey carried her through streets she had travelled thousands of times before. As the carriage climbed toward Royal Crescent, Eleanor watched familiar buildings pass beyond the window, each one carrying a memory she had long stopped trying to count. There was the narrow townhouse where she had once delivered twins during a fierce January snowstorm. A little farther along stood the baker's cottage, whose youngest daughter still sent Eleanor a small loaf every Christmas because she believed her own life had begun safely thanks to those gentle hands. Around another corner stood a house whose windows Eleanor could never pass without remembering a frightened young father who had run barefoot through the rain one autumn night to fetch her before his wife delivered their first son. Bath had become, in Eleanor's mind, less a city of streets than a city of births. Nearly every corner reminded her of a child, a family, or a long night that had ended with relief instead of sorrow. The Ashcroft residence was already bustling when Eleanor arrived. Servants moved quietly through the hall, carrying fresh basins of hot water and stacks of clean linen, while the scent of burning oak drifted from the fireplaces that had been kept lit throughout the night. Outside the bedchamber, Henry Ashcroft paced slowly along the corridor, pausing every few moments to listen before beginning his anxious walk again. His mother sat nearby, with folded hands resting upon an unopened prayer book, whispering prayers she no longer needed to read from memory. Neither rushed toward Eleanor when she entered the house. They simply looked at her, and almost immediately, the tension that had settled over the hallway seemed to ease, as though her arrival alone had already changed something. Inside the bedroom, Charlotte lay exhausted against a mountain of pillows, one hand gripping the blankets whenever another contraction arrived. The room was warm from the fire, yet the young mother's forehead glistened with perspiration, and every wave of pain seemed to steal another measure of confidence from her. Eleanor crossed the room with her usual unhurried movements, checked the fire, adjusted the blankets around Charlotte's shoulders, and took the young woman's trembling hand into her own. She did not begin by giving instructions. Instead, she waited until Charlotte looked directly at her. Only then did she speak. "You are doing better than you think," Eleanor said softly. "One breath at a time. We need no more than that." Charlotte nodded. When the next contraction came, Eleanor counted each slow breath with her, never once raising her voice, never once allowing urgency to replace reassurance. She had learned long ago that fear could spread through a room faster than any illness, and that calm, if guarded carefully enough, could spread just as surely. While the servants quietly changed towels and fresh water was brought upstairs, Eleanor remained beside the bed, watching not only the progress of the birth, but the expressions on every face in the room. She noticed when Charlotte's breathing became hurried. She noticed when the young woman's mother instinctively reached forward before deciding to let her daughter continue alone. She noticed when the fire burned too low, when the room became too warm, when the silence itself needed to be broken by nothing more than a gentle word of encouragement. By late morning, the long hours of labor finally gave way to the sound everyone had been waiting to hear. A strong newborn cry filled the room, followed almost immediately by the unmistakable sigh of relief that escaped Charlotte before she even opened her eyes. Outside the bedroom, Henry stopped pacing altogether. For a brief moment, he simply stood perfectly still, then laughed quietly to himself, before wiping away tears he had made no effort to hide. Eleanor carefully wrapped the baby girl in warm linen and placed her into her mother's waiting arms. Charlotte looked down at the tiny face resting against her and smiled through tears of exhaustion. "She's beautiful," she whispered. Those were the first words Eleanor wrote down later that afternoon. After making certain that both mother and daughter were comfortable, Eleanor opened the familiar blue notebook she carried everywhere. Most people assumed it contained only practical records of births, and indeed, each page began with the child's name, the date, the hour, and the family's address. Yet beneath those neat lines, Eleanor always left room for something else, details no physician would have considered important. She paused for a moment before writing, "Light rain before sunrise." The wisteria outside the eastern window had almost begun to bloom, The mother smiled before the baby cried. She believed such things deserved to be remembered because they belonged to the story of a life just as much as the hour written upon a birth certificate. One day, she often thought, someone might wonder what the world looked like on the morning they were born, and perhaps these small notes would answer that question long after everyone else had forgotten. When Eleanor finally stepped back onto the front steps of the Ashcroft house, the rain clouds had already drifted away, leaving the city bathed in gentle spring sunshine. She climbed into the waiting carriage, believing, quite naturally, that tomorrow would bring another letter, another anxious father, another frightened young mother, waiting to become someone new. For 28 years, that had always been the rhythm of her life, and she had no reason to imagine it would ever change. She could not have known that the little girl sleeping peacefully upstairs would become the last child she would ever deliver in the city of Bath. Not because Eleanor had grown too old, not because her hands had forgotten their work, but because, while she had been quietly welcoming one new life into the world that morning, the world beyond that quiet bedroom had already begun changing, and very soon it would stop asking for women like Eleanor Voss. The weeks that followed passed with a familiarity Eleanor had known for nearly 3 decades. Yet something within that familiar rhythm had begun to shift so quietly that at first she could hardly name it. Spring deepened across Bath, replacing the last traces of winter with climbing roses, flowering chestnut trees, and longer evenings filled with birdsong. Every morning, Eleanor continued to rise before sunrise, polish the brass clasp on her leather case, fold fresh linen for whatever birth the day might bring, and place a kettle upon the stove before sitting beside the front window to wait for the sound of approaching wheels. It had been her routine for so many years that she no longer questioned it. The city had always seemed to know where to find her whenever a child was ready to enter the world. Yet the carriages no longer came as often. At first, the change appeared so slight that Eleanor dismissed it as coincidence. One quiet week was hardly unusual. There were seasons when children seemed determined to arrive all at once, followed by days when Bath rested peacefully, as though the entire city had decided to catch its breath. Eleanor had lived through enough such cycles to know that work could never be measured by a single week. She simply spent the unexpected hours tending her small garden, mending worn baby blankets that mothers had returned with quiet gratitude, and updating the careful records in her blue notebook. She assumed that before long, another messenger would knock upon her door. But another week passed, then another. The waiting gradually became impossible to ignore. It was not that children had stopped being born. As Eleanor walked through the city each morning, she still noticed young fathers hurrying home with flowers beneath one arm, proud grandmothers carrying tiny parcels wrapped in white cloth, and nursemaids pushing prams through the public gardens. New life continued to arrive in Bath, exactly as it always had. It was only arriving somewhere else. The explanation, when it finally reached her, did not come through gossip or unkindness. It arrived in the pages of the Bath Chronicle, folded neatly beside a loaf of bread outside the baker's shop one Tuesday morning. The front page announced the opening of a modern maternity practice, established by 2 newly qualified obstetric physicians from London. The article praised their medical training, described the latest instruments imported from the capital, and spoke enthusiastically of the future of childbirth under scientific supervision. There was nothing cruel in the language. The newspaper did not criticize traditional midwives. It simply celebrated progress with the quiet certainty of an age convinced that newer must inevitably mean better. Eleanor read the article once before folding the paper again. She did not feel anger, only a curious stillness. She had always believed that there would be room in the world for every person who wished to care for mothers and children. If new doctors could save lives, she welcomed them sincerely. During her career, She had worked alongside many physicians whose wisdom she admired deeply. What unsettled her was not the arrival of medicine itself, but the sudden feeling that experience accumulated patiently over 28 years could disappear almost overnight beneath the weight of a newer idea. Over the following months, the change became impossible to mistake. Families who had once written to Eleanor as soon as a pregnancy was confirmed now sent polite letters thanking her for many years of faithful service, before explaining that their physician had recommended hospital care instead. Others never wrote at all. Eleanor would simply hear, weeks later, that another healthy child had been born under the care of one of the city's new specialists. None of the letters were unkind. That, perhaps, made them harder to read. One mother wrote that her husband felt more reassured knowing a doctor would attend the birth. Another apologized repeatedly, insisting that Eleanor must not take the decision personally because everyone seemed to be choosing the same arrangement. One elderly grandmother even visited Eleanor herself, bringing a small basket of preserves and saying with genuine embarrassment that although she herself had trusted no one but Mrs. Voss, her daughter believed modern medicine represented the future. "The young people think differently now," she said quietly. "I suppose every generation does." Eleanor smiled warmly and assured the woman she understood, and she truly believed she did. The world had always changed. Children grew into adults. Villages became towns. Horse-drawn carriages gave way to steam trains. It seemed only natural that medicine should also continue changing. Still, understanding a thing did not prevent it from hurting. The pain came not from rejection, but from absence. No one told Eleanor she was no longer capable. No one questioned her skill. People continued greeting her warmly whenever they met in the streets of Bath. Mothers still introduced their children by saying, "Mrs. Voss was there the night you were born." Fathers still tipped their hats respectfully as she passed. Shopkeepers still asked after her health. Nothing outwardly had changed, except that nobody knocked on her door anymore. Each morning, she continued preparing exactly as she always had. Fresh linen was folded, instruments were cleaned, the fire was lit. Her leather case stood waiting beside the front door. Sometimes, she found herself listening for wheels that never arrived. Sometimes, she glanced toward the window after hearing horses pass outside, only to realize the carriage belonged to someone visiting another house entirely. Without quite intending to, Eleanor began measuring her days not by the birth she attended, but by the silence between one morning and the next. One afternoon, while walking home through Queen Square, she noticed a familiar young woman stepping carefully from a carriage with a sleeping infant in her arms. Eleanor recognized her immediately. 5 years earlier, she had delivered the woman's first child during a long and difficult winter night. The young mother smiled as soon as she saw Eleanor. "Mrs. Voss," she called happily. "How lovely to see you." She introduced the baby as her second daughter. The child had been born only 3 weeks before. Eleanor congratulated her warmly and admired the sleeping infant. For a brief moment, neither woman mentioned the birth itself. Then the young mother hesitated before saying, almost apologetically, "Dr. Pembroke attended this time." She waited, as though expecting disappointment. Instead, Eleanor simply smiled. "I hope everything went well." "Oh, perfectly," the young mother replied quickly. "He was very kind." There was an awkward pause. "I often thought of you." Eleanor reached gently into the pram and adjusted the baby's blanket, where it had slipped from one tiny shoulder. "That was kind of you." They exchanged another smile before parting. As Eleanor continued home, she realized she felt no resentment toward the young mother, nor toward Dr. Pembroke, nor toward anyone else. What saddened her was something much quieter. For the first time in 28 years, A child had entered the world in Bath without ever knowing her name. That evening, as the light faded beyond the windows of her small house, Eleanor sat at her writing desk with the familiar blue notebook open before her. She turned slowly through page after page filled with names, dates, flowers, weather, and first words spoken by mothers who had long since watched those children grow into adults. Then she reached the final completed page. Beyond it waited several blank sheets. She rested her hand gently upon them. For many years she had assumed those empty pages would gradually fill themselves, one birth after another, until there was no room left to write. Now, for the first time, she wondered whether they might remain blank far longer than she had ever imagined. She closed the notebook carefully and placed it back inside her leather case. Outside, the bells of Bath rang peacefully across the evening, as they always had. The city had not stopped needing children to be born. It had simply begun believing that those children no longer needed Eleanor Voss to welcome them into the world. Summer settled gently over Bath, and with it came a quieter rhythm than Eleanor had ever known. There were still mornings when she woke before dawn out of habit, lit the kitchen fire, folded fresh linen, and checked the contents of her leather case before placing it beside the front door, exactly as she had done for nearly 3 decades. Some habits, she had learned, belonged not to necessity, but to memory. They remained long after the world had stopped asking for them. Every few days she replaced the dried lavender tucked inside the case, sharpened the small pencil she carried in her notebook, and carefully washed the white cloths that might never again be used. None of these tasks took very long, yet together they filled the quiet hours that childbirth had once occupied so completely. By early June, Eleanor had almost stopped expecting the sound of carriage wheels outside her gate. Instead, she found herself listening to smaller things: the sparrows nesting beneath the roof, the clock in the sitting room marking each passing hour, the rustling leaves of the climbing rose outside her window. Life had become unexpectedly still. She did not resent the stillness, but neither did she belong to it. There were moments when she would glance toward the empty chair where her leather case waited and instinctively calculate how long it would take to reach Royal Crescent or Sydney Place, before remembering that no one was waiting for her there. One warm afternoon, while she was trimming lavender in the small garden behind her house, a knock came at the front door. It was not the hurried knock of a frightened husband, nor the confident knock of a servant sent by one of Bath's larger households. It came once, then, after a brief pause, once again. When Eleanor opened the door, she found the village postman holding a single envelope. Its cream-colored paper, noticeably rougher than the fine stationery used by most of the families in Bath. The address had been written in careful, deliberate handwriting, and the wax seal bore no family crest, only the simple impression of a small parish church. "From Yorkshire," the postman said pleasantly. "Rather a long journey for a single letter." Eleanor thanked him and carried the envelope inside. She placed it upon the dining table beside her untouched cup of tea, but did not open it immediately. Over the years, she had received hundreds of letters. Most had contained requests to attend births. Others carried invitations to christenings, Christmas greetings, or small notes of thanks written months after a child had safely arrived. This letter felt different before she had even broken the seal. At last she unfolded the paper. The letter began simply: "Dear Mrs. Eleanor Voss, my name is Samuel Ashcroft, and I serve as the parish minister in the village of Low Thorpe." Eleanor frowned slightly. The name was familiar, though she could not immediately remember why. She continued reading. The minister wrote that more than 20 years earlier he had not been a minister at all, but a young schoolmaster living in Bath with his wife Rebecca. Their first child had arrived much too early during a difficult spring, and the physician, who had attended Rebecca, feared that neither mother nor baby would survive the night. Someone had sent for Eleanor Voss. As Eleanor's eyes moved slowly across the page, the memory returned with surprising clarity. A small brick house near the eastern edge of the city, a frightened young husband who could not keep his hands from trembling, a tiny baby so light she had seemed scarcely heavier than the blanket wrapped around her. Rebecca, Samuel, little Grace. Eleanor could picture them all. The minister's letter continued. "You may not remember us, Mrs. Voss. I imagine you have welcomed far too many children into the world to remember every family. But my wife and I have never forgotten you. The little girl you helped save that evening is now 23 years old. She teaches reading to the younger children of our village and has become the greatest blessing our family has ever known." Eleanor lowered the letter for a moment. She remembered Grace now, not as the grown woman described on the page, but as the tiny infant who had spent her first night wrapped in warmed blankets beside the kitchen fire because she had been too small to hold her own warmth. She smiled quietly before continuing. The tone of the letter gradually changed. Samuel explained that several years earlier, he and his family had returned to his wife's home village of Low Thorpe after accepting the parish there. The village lay far from any large town, surrounded by farmland and low hills, peaceful for most of the year, but isolated whenever winter storms arrived. The nearest physician lived almost 2 days away by horse and cart, and while people managed well enough through ordinary illnesses, childbirth remained a constant source of fear. There had once been a midwife in Low Thorpe. She had died the previous autumn. Since then, the women of the village had relied mostly upon one another. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they did not. Samuel did not describe those losses in detail. He did not need to. His careful choice of words carried enough sorrow on its own. "Mrs. Voss," he wrote, "I realize I am asking a great deal of someone I have not seen in over 20 years. I cannot offer the comforts of Bath, nor the respect your long service surely deserves. Ours is a small farming village with little money and few conveniences. What I can offer is a cottage beside the church, a garden that has gone rather wild but receives the morning sun, and a community that has found itself in need of exactly the kind of wisdom you once gave our family." Eleanor read those lines twice, then a third time. Finally, near the bottom of the page, she found the sentence that caused her hands to remain perfectly still. "If you are still willing to welcome children into this world, there are mothers here who are waiting for you." There was nothing dramatic about those words. No promise of payment, no attempt to flatter her, no appeal to duty. Only a simple statement. There are mothers here who are waiting for you. Eleanor realized, with quiet surprise, that no one had spoken words like those to her for many months. She folded the letter carefully and looked around the silent room. Her leather case still stood beside the front door. Her notebook still waited inside it. Everything in the house remained exactly as it had always been. Only the purpose had gone. For a long while, she sat without moving, listening to the distant sounds of Bath drifting through the open window, the clip of horses upon stone, children laughing somewhere beyond the garden wall, a church bell marking the hour. She loved this city. It had given her nearly 30 years filled with meaning. It had trusted her with its daughters, its grandchildren, and its hopes. Yet, as she looked once more at the letter resting upon the table, another thought entered her mind, so gently that she hardly noticed it at first. Perhaps the world had not stopped needing Eleanor Voss. Perhaps it was only Bath that no longer did. That evening, before retiring to bed, she placed Samuel Ashcroft's letter inside the blue notebook, marking the first blank page that still waited to be filled. She did not yet know what her answer would be, but for the first time in many months, tomorrow no longer looked exactly like yesterday. For 3 days, Samuel Ashcroft's letter remained on Eleanor's dining table, exactly where she had first unfolded it. Each morning, she moved it aside to set down her teacup, and each evening, she placed it carefully back in the center of the table before extinguishing the lamps. She did not answer it immediately, not because she doubted the sincerity of the invitation, but because she understood that accepting it would mean more than traveling to another village. It would mean admitting that the life she had built in Bath had quietly come to its natural end. During those days, she walked through the city more often than usual, almost as though she wished to see every familiar street one final time before making a decision. She crossed Pulteney Bridge in the early mornings, when the shopkeepers were only beginning to arrange their windows. She wandered through Sydney Gardens, where children chased one another beneath the young green leaves, while their nurses called after them with patient voices. She passed Royal Crescent just as the afternoon sunlight turned the pale limestone a warm shade of gold, and she found herself slowing, almost without noticing, whenever she came upon a house where she remembered helping a frightened young mother many years before. Bath had not rejected her. That thought returned again and again. The city had simply continued moving in a different direction. No one had spoken harshly to her. No one had questioned her skill. The families who no longer called upon her still greeted her kindly in the street. Some stopped to introduce children who had grown taller than Eleanor remembered. Others asked after her health, or thanked her once again for being present on the happiest day of their lives. Their affection had not faded, only their need had. At first, Eleanor had believed those two things were the same. Now she was beginning to understand they were not. One afternoon she paused outside a handsome townhouse where she had once delivered 3 children over the course of 12 years. As she stood for a moment, looking toward its familiar windows, the front door opened, and a young physician stepped outside, carrying a polished black medical bag. Eleanor recognized him immediately from the newspaper article she had read weeks before. Dr. Pembroke. The doctor smiled politely as their paths crossed. "Mrs. Voss," he said, tipping his hat with genuine respect. "I've heard your name spoken many times. So have I yours, doctor. I hope you are well." "Very well, thank you." There was no awkwardness between them, no competition, no bitterness. The young physician hesitated before speaking again. "I've met several mothers who still talk about you with great affection." Eleanor smiled. "They were always very brave women." Dr. Pembroke nodded. "I imagine they learned some of that from you." For a brief moment, they simply stood together in the quiet street. Then the doctor wished her a pleasant afternoon and continued on his way. Eleanor watched him disappear around the corner before turning back toward home. She found herself smiling, not because she had suddenly accepted everything without sadness, but because she realized something important. The future was not being built against her. It was simply being built without her. And perhaps that was not the same thing at all. That evening, Eleanor unlocked the small cabinet beside her writing desk and removed a wooden box she had not opened for many years. Inside lay a handful of personal belongings collected over the course of her career. A tiny knitted bonnet made by a grandmother who had insisted Eleanor keep it after a difficult winter birth. A pressed forget-me-not tucked inside an old Christmas card. A silver thimble given to her by a dressmaker whose 5th child had arrived safely one autumn evening. Beneath these small treasures rested the earliest pages of her notebooks, tied together with a faded blue ribbon. She spent nearly an hour turning through them. Names, dates, tiny observations. The baby's father cried before anyone else. Apple blossom outside the window, Heavy snow, all day, twins, the grandmother sang during the birth. No medical journal would ever have preserved such things. Yet Eleanor had always believed they mattered. Birth was never only about bringing a child safely into the world. It was also about remembering how that new life had first entered it. When she finally closed the notebooks, her eyes fell upon the newest volume. Its final pages remained almost untouched. She rested one hand gently upon the blank paper. There were still many stories waiting to be written. Only not here. The following morning, Eleanor sat down at her writing desk with a fresh sheet of stationery before her. She dipped her pen into the inkwell, paused for a long moment, and then began writing. Dear Reverend Ashcroft, your letter has stayed with me every hour since it arrived. I remember your family far more clearly than you imagined I might. I remember your wife's courage, your daughter's remarkable determination to live, and the relief upon your face when morning finally came. She stopped writing for a moment, looking out through the window toward the quiet street below. Then she continued, If the people of Low Thorpe truly believe an old midwife may still be of use to them, I should be honored to come. I cannot promise miracles, only the experience of many years and a willingness to serve wherever I am needed. At the very bottom, she added one final sentence. Please tell the mothers of your village that I shall arrive before the first autumn frost. She folded the letter carefully, sealed it, and carried it herself to the post office. When she stepped back onto the street, she felt unexpectedly light, as though a decision that had been quietly forming for weeks had finally found its proper shape. The days that followed became unexpectedly busy. Eleanor owned very little, and that made leaving both easier and more difficult. She sold several pieces of furniture to a young married couple just beginning their own household. She donated boxes of medical books to the local nursing school, keeping only those volumes whose margins were filled with her own handwritten notes. She packed her linen, her instruments, her notebooks, a handful of dresses suitable for country life, and the heavy wool shawl that had accompanied her through more winter births than she could count. Neighbors came to say goodbye one by one. The baker's wife embraced her with tears in her eyes. The florist refused to accept payment for a small bouquet of white roses. Even Dr. Pembroke called one afternoon, not as a physician, but simply as a colleague. I hope Low Thorpe understands how fortunate they are, he said quietly. So do I, Eleanor replied with a gentle smile. On the morning of her departure, Bath looked much as it always had. The bells rang, shopkeepers swept their front steps, carriages crossed the familiar streets. Nothing in the city announced that one chapter had ended. As the train slowly pulled away from the station, Eleanor watched the elegant rooftops of Bath recede into the distance until they were softened by the morning mist. She felt sadness. She would always love this city. It had given her purpose for nearly 30 years, but beneath that sadness rested something she had not expected to feel again: anticipation. Somewhere beyond the rolling green hills, beyond villages whose names she had never heard until a few weeks before, there was a place called Low Thorpe. She knew almost nothing about it, only that somewhere in that quiet village were women she had never met who were already waiting for her. By the time Eleanor's train reached the small station nearest Low Thorpe, the warmth of late summer had already begun to fade. The air carried the first quiet hints of autumn, and a cool wind swept across the open fields as though there was nothing between the village and the distant northern hills to slow it down. The station itself was little more than a single platform, a weathered wooden shelter, and a station master who greeted arriving passengers by name whenever he could. Only 3 people stepped off the afternoon train that day, and before long, Eleanor found herself alone beside her leather case while the locomotive disappeared into the countryside, leaving behind a silence so complete that she could hear the crows calling from across the fields. A small pony cart waited near the station gate, where a kindly grey-haired man raised his hat as soon as he saw her. He introduced himself as Reverend Samuel Ashcroft, though Eleanor recognized him almost immediately before he had finished speaking. More than 20 years had changed his hair from dark brown to silver and placed gentle lines around his eyes. Yet his smile remained exactly as she remembered from that anxious spring morning in Bath when he had first become a father. "I wasn't certain you would come," he admitted as he lifted her leather case onto the cart. "I wasn't certain either," Eleanor replied with a quiet smile, "until I realized your letter had already answered the question before I had asked it." Samuel nodded, understanding, without needing anything further explained. The road to Low Thorpe wound slowly through open countryside. Unlike anything Eleanor had known in Bath, there were no elegant crescents or rows of honey-colored townhouses here. Instead, dry stone walls divided wide green fields where sheep grazed peacefully beneath a broad grey sky. Small streams crossed the road beneath ancient stone bridges, and every few miles they passed a lonely farmhouse whose chimney smoke drifted lazily into the cool afternoon air. The journey was neither beautiful nor dramatic in the way artists often painted the English countryside. It was quieter than that, simpler, a place where the land seemed to ask very little from the people who lived upon it, except patience and hard work. After nearly an hour, the road curved gently around a low hill, and Samuel pointed ahead with the reins. "There," he said softly, "that's Low Thorpe." The village was smaller than Eleanor had imagined. A cluster of weathered stone cottages surrounded a modest church with a square bell tower that rose just high enough to be seen above the surrounding trees. Chickens wandered freely between garden gates. Smoke drifted from chimneys despite the mild afternoon. The narrow lane that served as the village's main street was deeply rutted from wagons and softened by recent rain, forcing the pony to pick its way carefully through patches of thick mud. There was no doctor's surgery, no pharmacy, no grand houses stood above the others. It was simply a farming village that had changed very little in generations. "It isn't much," Samuel said, apologetically. Eleanor looked around at the cottages, the vegetable gardens, the children chasing one another outside the churchyard, and the women hanging washing between stone walls. "It is exactly what you described. And does it disappoint you?" She smiled gently. "No, it reminds me that people are born everywhere." Samuel laughed quietly. "I had hoped you might say something like that." As they continued toward the small cottage prepared for Eleanor beside the church, several villagers paused in their work to watch the unfamiliar visitor arrive. Most offered polite nods, a few smiled cautiously, others simply observed in silence before returning to whatever they had been doing. Eleanor noticed that no one appeared unfriendly. Neither did anyone appear especially relieved. She understood immediately. News traveled slowly in villages. Trust traveled even more slowly. Samuel helped carry her belongings inside the little stone cottage, where a fire already burned in the hearth, despite the afternoon light still lingering outside. The house consisted of only 4 rooms, a modest kitchen, a sitting room with 2 small windows overlooking the churchyard, a bedroom beneath the sloping roof, and a tiny room that Samuel suggested could become a place where mothers might visit if they wished to speak with her privately. "I hope you'll be comfortable here," he said. "I think I shall. You'll find the village kind." "I never doubted that." Samuel hesitated before adding carefully, "Though kindness and trust are not always the same thing." Eleanor looked at him with quiet curiosity. "You've written to them about me?" "To everyone. And they're grateful you've come." He paused. "But they've never needed anyone except Martha." It was the first time Eleanor had heard the name. She noticed Samuel choosing his next words with particular care, Martha Greaves has delivered nearly every child born in this village for the last 40 years. I see. She isn't a trained midwife. No, she has never studied medicine. Eleanor smiled softly. Neither had most midwives when I first began. Samuel returned the smile, though it quickly faded again. Martha has never claimed to know everything, but she knows these people better than anyone. Before Eleanor could ask another question, a firm knock sounded against the front door. Samuel looked toward it, almost instinctively. I imagine that's her. The woman who entered appeared older than Eleanor had expected, though age had done little to diminish the strength in her posture. Martha Greaves stood several inches shorter than Eleanor, her silver hair gathered beneath a plain brown bonnet, her heavy boots still carrying dried mud from the fields. Her hands immediately drew Eleanor's attention. They were broad, weathered hands, marked by years of washing linen, carrying water, tending fires, comforting frightened mothers, and lifting countless newborn children into the world. They were not delicate hands. They were working hands. For a few moments, the two women simply regarded one another. Samuel made the introductions. Martha, this is Mrs. Eleanor Voss. Martha removed one glove before extending her hand. So, she said quietly, you've come all the way from Bath. I have. I expect the journey was longer than anyone deserves. It gave me plenty of time to think. Martha nodded once. I imagine it did. There was no hostility in her voice. Neither was there warmth, only careful distance. Samuel sensed that the conversation belonged to the two women now, and quietly excused himself, promising to return the following morning. When the door closed behind him, silence settled over the small cottage. It was Martha who finally spoke. The Reverend tells me you worked for rich families, mostly, and that people thought highly of you. I was fortunate. Martha glanced briefly around the modest room before returning her attention to Eleanor. We don't have rich families here. I didn't expect any. We don't have polished floors. I noticed. We don't have doctors. I know. Martha folded her gloves slowly into one weathered hand. What we do have, she paused, is one another. Eleanor waited. For 40 years, Martha continued, the women here have brought children into this world together. Mothers, sisters, neighbors, sometimes me. We don't always do things the way they teach in the cities. I expect not. We've made mistakes. I'm sure every midwife has. We've lost babies. Eleanor lowered her eyes. So have I. The answer seemed to surprise Martha. For the first time, she looked at Eleanor not as someone from Bath, but simply as another woman who had spent a lifetime standing beside childbirth. After a long silence, Martha spoke again, though more quietly this time. I don't mind learning something new. No, no. She shook her head gently. What frightens me? Again she searched for the right words. Is that if everyone decides your way is better? Her eyes drifted toward the churchyard outside. They'll begin believing everything I've done for 40 years was wrong. The words hung quietly between them. There was no accusation in them, only fear. Not fear of losing work, not fear of losing respect, but fear that an entire lifetime of doing one's best might suddenly be remembered as a lifetime of not being good enough. Eleanor understood that feeling more deeply than Martha could possibly know. She stepped closer and answered with complete sincerity, I didn't come here to prove anyone wrong. Martha looked directly into her eyes. I hope not. So do I. Neither woman said anything more. When Martha finally turned toward the door, she paused with one hand upon the latch. The women here won't come to you straight away. I know. They'll come to me. I expect they should. Martha looked almost puzzled by the answer. You aren't disappointed? Eleanor smiled. No. Why not? Because children are rarely born in a hurry. She paused. And neither is trust. For the first time since entering the cottage, Something softened in Martha's expression. Not agreement, not friendship, only the smallest suggestion that perhaps the woman from Bath understood more than she had first imagined. After Martha disappeared into the gathering evening, Eleanor stood alone beside the window, watching the last light settle over the cottages of Low Thorpe. She had travelled hundreds of miles believing she had come to serve a village that needed her. Now, as she watched Martha walk slowly home along the muddy lane, she realized something she had not expected. The greatest challenge waiting for her would not be delivering babies. It would be convincing one good woman that another good woman did not erase the life she had already spent caring for everyone else. The days that followed settled into a rhythm so gentle that, at first, Eleanor wondered whether she had imagined the urgency in Reverend Ashcroft's letter. Each morning she opened the shutters just after sunrise and looked out across the churchyard, where dew rested upon the grass, and the first smoke of the day rose quietly from the chimneys scattered throughout Low Thorpe. The village awakened slowly. Farmers crossed the lanes with their carts before the church bell rang. Children carried pails to the village well, and women paused to exchange a few words over low stone walls before disappearing into kitchens where bread was already baking. It was a peaceful place, and yet beneath that peacefulness, Eleanor could sense a quiet caution that never quite disappeared whenever someone glanced in her direction. She soon discovered that Martha had spoken the truth. No expectant mother came to her door. From the kitchen window, Eleanor often saw women walking past her cottage, on their way to visit Martha Greaves instead. Some carried baskets of eggs or fresh bread as small gifts of gratitude. Others simply stopped by to ask advice about a swollen ankle, an aching back, or a restless baby who refused to sleep through the night. Martha's little cottage remained busy from morning until evening, while Eleanor's front gate rarely opened except for the postman or Reverend Ashcroft bringing vegetables from the church garden. Strangely, Eleanor did not feel insulted, disappointed perhaps, lonely at times, but not insulted. She understood that trust was never something a stranger could simply inherit. Every woman in Low Thorpe had known Martha for years. Many had entered the world through Martha's hands before later placing their own children into those same hands. Eleanor herself would have been surprised if the village had welcomed her without hesitation. Birth was too intimate for that. Mothers did not entrust their fears to unfamiliar faces simply because someone else suggested they should. So, instead of waiting by the window, Eleanor began quietly making the little cottage her own. She scrubbed the soot from the kitchen fireplace until the old stone brightened once more beneath her hands. She mended loose hinges on the garden gate with the help of the blacksmith's son, planted lavender and chamomile beneath the front window, and turned the neglected patch of earth behind the cottage into a modest herb garden filled with rosemary, mint, yarrow, and lemon balm. Before long, the house no longer looked like a place prepared for a visitor. It began to resemble the home of someone who intended to stay. Sometimes villagers paused outside the garden fence, while Eleanor worked among the herbs. Most offered polite greetings. A few asked about the flowers. None asked about childbirth. She answered every question with the same patient warmth, never attempting to steer the conversation toward the subject everyone seemed determined to avoid. Weeks passed in that quiet way. Then, one rainy afternoon, everything changed with a knock that was almost too timid to hear. Eleanor looked up from the table, where she had been repairing the handle of a wicker basket. When she opened the door, she found a young woman standing beneath the dripping eaves, clutching a small boy wrapped tightly in a wool blanket. The child could not have been more than 18 months old. His cheeks were flushed with fever, his damp curls clung to his forehead, and every few moments a weak cry escaped before he buried his face against his mother's shoulder once more. The young woman hesitated, as though she were no longer certain she should have come. "I'm terribly sorry to trouble you," she said softly. "Mrs. Greaves has gone to one of the farms beyond the river, and they said she might not return until tomorrow." Eleanor stepped aside immediately. "Please come in." The woman crossed the threshold without another word. Inside, Eleanor settled the child near the fire before gently feeling his forehead and listening to his breathing. She asked simple questions rather than many complicated ones. Had he eaten? Had he been sick? How long had the fever lasted? Had he managed to sleep? The young mother answered each question carefully, though Eleanor noticed she apologized almost every time she spoke, as though fearing she might somehow give the wrong answer. "There are no wrong answers here," Eleanor said with a reassuring smile. "Only helpful ones." The young woman looked visibly relieved. Eleanor soon recognized that the boy's illness, though uncomfortable, was not dangerous. His fever needed watching, but more than anything, he needed fluids, rest, warmth, and a mother who felt less frightened than she did now. Eleanor filled a basin with cool water, showed the young woman how to gently lower the child's temperature without chilling him, explained how often to offer him small sips of water, and demonstrated how to keep him comfortably wrapped while allowing the fever to escape gradually. She spoke slowly, never hurried, never making the mother feel foolish for not already knowing. When the young woman confessed that she worried she had done everything wrong, Eleanor quietly shook her head. No mother has ever loved her child less because she asked for help. The woman lowered her eyes. "I thought perhaps you'd tell me I should have known what to do." Eleanor smiled gently. "I've met mothers in grand houses with 10 servants who believed exactly the same thing." That surprised the young woman enough to make her laugh. Only a little, but enough. An hour later, the little boy had fallen peacefully asleep in his mother's arms, his breathing slower and his forehead already beginning to cool. As she prepared to leave, the young woman reached into her apron pocket and produced a few carefully folded coins. "It's not much." Eleanor quietly closed the woman's fingers around them. "You'll need those more than I do. I can't ask you to." "You didn't," she smiled. "You asked me to help your son." The woman stood silently for several moments before whispering her thanks. The next morning, Eleanor thought no more about the visit. She spent the early hours tending her herbs before returning indoors to prepare breakfast. Then another knock came. This time, it was an elderly grandmother asking whether nettle tea truly helped with morning sickness. An hour later, a young wife arrived, wanting advice about swaddling her first baby before winter. By afternoon, another woman came carrying a newborn whose skin had developed a harmless rash that nevertheless worried his parents terribly. None of them came asking Eleanor to deliver a child. None announced that they trusted her. Each began almost the same way. "I only have one small question," or "Martha usually tells me," or "I wondered whether." Eleanor answered every question with the same quiet patience. She never criticized Martha's advice. When she agreed with Martha, she said so plainly. When she suggested something different, she explained why, without making anyone feel corrected. If she did not know an answer with certainty, she admitted it honestly. Slowly, something almost invisible began to change. Not in Eleanor, in the women themselves. They no longer stood nervously on the doorstep. They came inside. They accepted tea. Some stayed long enough to admire the growing herb garden before walking home again. Late one afternoon, Reverend Ashcroft stopped by, carrying a basket of apples from the church orchard. As he approached the cottage, he noticed 3 women leaving by the front gate, chatting quietly among themselves. "I see you've been busy," he remarked. Eleanor looked toward the road, where the women disappeared around the corner. Not particularly. They've been here. They had questions. Samuel smiled knowingly. And did you answer them? I tried. He looked around the little sitting room, where several cups still waited upon the table beside an empty basin and neatly folded cloths. They'll come back. Eleanor shook her head gently. Perhaps. You don't sound convinced. I've learned something since arriving here. And what is that? She glanced toward the open front door, where the afternoon sunlight warmed the stone step. A village doesn't begin trusting someone because she performs one remarkable thing. She paused before smiling softly. It begins trusting her because she never makes anyone feel embarrassed for asking ordinary questions. That evening, as Eleanor watered the lavender outside her cottage, she noticed something she had not seen before. A young mother, walking past on the opposite side of the lane, lifted her hand in greeting. Beside her, another woman did the same. Neither stopped. Neither spoke. Yet both smiled. It was only the smallest gesture, but Eleanor understood villages well enough to recognize what it meant. No one in Low Thorpe was ready to place a new life into her hands. Not yet. But at last, they had begun knocking on her door. It was nearly 6 weeks after Eleanor arrived in Low Thorpe when someone finally knocked on her door after sunset. The evening had settled quietly over the village. A light rain had fallen throughout the afternoon, leaving the narrow lanes dark with damp earth, while a cool breeze carried the scent of wet grass through the open kitchen window. Eleanor had just finished writing a few notes in her blue notebook after another day spent answering questions from young mothers, and the kettle was beginning to sing softly above the fire when 3 hurried knocks broke the stillness. She opened the door to find a young man standing on the step, his boots thick with mud and his face pale with worry. Mrs. Voss? Yes, my wife. He paused to catch his breath. I think the baby is coming. Eleanor reached for her cloak before asking another question. How long has she been in labor? Only a few hours. And is this her first child? He nodded quickly. Yes. Has anyone gone for Martha? I've already sent my brother. For the briefest moment, the young man looked embarrassed. I wasn't sure who would arrive first. Eleanor smiled gently. Then perhaps we'll both arrive exactly when we're needed. She picked up her leather case, extinguished the lamp beside the window, and followed him into the cool evening. The cottage stood at the far edge of the village, beside a narrow stream that reflected the last traces of daylight beneath the clouds. Warm candlelight glowed through the small windows, and even before Eleanor stepped inside, she could hear the anxious voices waiting within. The room was crowded, too crowded. An elderly aunt stood near the fireplace, whispering prayers beneath her breath. 2 neighbors folded clean linen at the kitchen table while pretending not to watch the bedroom door. The young husband's mother moved restlessly from one room to another, asking every few minutes whether anyone needed more hot water. No one really knew what to do, so everyone tried to do something. Eleanor had seen such scenes countless times before. She removed her gloves, smiled warmly, then spoke in the same calm voice she had carried into hundreds of homes across Bath. Let's make a little more space. No one questioned her. Within moments, the room became quieter. The aunt was asked to keep the fire steady. One neighbor filled fresh basins. Another opened the bedroom window just enough to let cool air enter without chilling the room. The young husband looked ready to apologize for everything all at once. Eleanor simply placed one reassuring hand upon his shoulder. She's frightened, she said softly. So am I. I know. He looked down at the floor. What if something goes wrong? Eleanor answered without hesitation. Then we'll deal with it together. The young mother, whose name was Alice Turner, lay exhausted upon the bed, her breathing quick and uneven. Long before the labor itself had become difficult, She could not have been more than 22 years old. As Eleanor approached, Alice gripped the blanket tightly. "I can't do this," she whispered before another contraction had even begun. "Yes, you can. I don't think I can. You already are." Alice shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "I'm afraid." Eleanor sat beside the bed, rather than immediately examining her. She took the young woman's cold hands gently between her own. "Do you know something I've learned after all these years?" Alice looked at her uncertainly. "I've never met a brave mother who wasn't frightened first." The young woman frowned slightly. "Really? Every single one?" Even Eleanor smiled a little. "Fear usually arrives before the baby does." Alice laughed despite herself, only for a moment, but the room became lighter because of it. The labor itself was not especially complicated. The baby was well positioned. Alice was healthy. Both mother and child were strong enough. The greatest obstacle was neither pain nor danger. It was fear. Every contraction seemed to convince Alice she could not survive another one, and every time she believed that, her body became tense, making the next contraction even harder. Eleanor had seen this many times before. She did not respond with complicated instructions. Instead, she remained beside Alice through every wave of pain, guiding each slow breath, reminding her to release the tension from her shoulders, gently wiping the damp hair from her forehead whenever another contraction passed. Sometimes she spoke, sometimes she simply stayed silent. More than once she found Alice searching the room until their eyes met again. Only then would the young mother begin breathing steadily. Nearly an hour passed before the bedroom door opened quietly. Martha Greaves stepped inside. Her boots were wet from the muddy lanes, and the old lantern she carried still flickered from the evening wind. She looked first toward Eleanor, then toward Alice. Without a word, Martha set down the lantern, washed her hands, and moved to the opposite side of the bed. Neither woman discussed who should take charge. There was no need. Eleanor continued guiding the labor. Martha quietly supported Alice's shoulders whenever another contraction came. Occasionally, one woman handed the other a clean cloth or a basin of warm water. Their movements fit together naturally, almost as though they had worked side by side for years rather than meeting only weeks before. The family watched in complete silence. No one had expected this. Most had assumed the two women would disagree. Instead, they hardly needed words at all. Near midnight, the baby's first cry filled the little cottage. It was strong, healthy. The sound seemed almost too large for such a small room. Alice closed her eyes as tears slipped quietly across her cheeks. Her husband covered his face with both hands before laughing softly through his relief. One of the neighbors hurried outside to tell the waiting family that mother and child were safe. Eleanor carefully wrapped the little girl in warm blankets before placing her gently into Alice's tired arms. For several long moments, the young mother simply looked down at her daughter. Then she whispered, "She's here." No grand speech followed, no dramatic celebration. Only the deep, peaceful silence that often arrives after everyone realizes the worst has already passed. Before leaving, Eleanor opened her familiar blue notebook. She wrote the child's name, the date, the hour. Then, beneath those simple details, she added another line. Light rain through the evening. The fire burned low before midnight. The mother laughed once between contractions and never forgot how to breathe after that. As she closed the notebook, she noticed Martha watching her from across the room. "What do you always write?" Martha asked quietly. Eleanor smiled. "The parts people think they'll remember forever. And don't, they remember the child." She gently returned the notebook to her leather case. "I simply remember the rest." Martha said nothing. But for the first time since Eleanor had arrived in Low Thorpe, there was no caution left in her eyes, only curiosity. Several weeks later, While Eleanor was buying eggs from the Turner farm, she overheard Alice speaking to another expectant mother. The woman asked whether Mrs. Voss was truly as skilled as people had begun saying. Alice looked down at the baby, sleeping peacefully in her arms. Then she smiled. To tell you the truth, she paused, I don't remember much about that night. The pain? No. The birth? No. What then? Alice gently adjusted the blanket around her daughter. I don't remember what Mrs. Voss actually did. She looked toward the lane where Eleanor was walking home beneath the autumn sunshine. I only remember that, once she sat beside me, I wasn't afraid anymore. Eleanor never heard those words herself. She did not need to, because from that day forward, when another young mother found herself waiting for her first child, she no longer asked whether Mrs. Voss truly knew what she was doing. She only asked where the little stone cottage beside the church could be found. Autumn settled gently over Low Thorpe, and before long, Eleanor found herself measuring time, not by the pages of a calendar, but by the changing colors of the fields beyond the village. The wheat had already been gathered. Smoke rose more frequently from cottage chimneys as the evenings grew colder, and the church bell seemed to ring through clearer air now that summer had quietly slipped away. The little herb garden outside Eleanor's cottage had flourished beyond her expectations. Lavender leaned against the stone wall. Rosemary had grown into sturdy bushes, and bunches of drying chamomile hung from the kitchen beams, filling the cottage with a faint, comforting fragrance whenever the fire was lit. Life had become busier than it had been when she first arrived. Mothers now came to her with questions almost every day. Some sought advice before their babies were due, while others stopped only long enough to ask whether a cough sounded serious or whether a restless infant ought to be wrapped more warmly at night. Eleanor noticed that no one announced they had begun trusting her. Trust, she was learning, rarely arrived with a declaration. It revealed itself quietly, one small visit at a time, until one day it simply existed, without anyone remembering precisely when it had begun. There was, however, one person whose confidence she had not yet earned completely. Martha Greaves remained the first person most families called whenever labor began. More often than not, Eleanor would arrive at a cottage only to find Martha already there, sleeves rolled above her wrists, apron dusted with flour, because she had clearly left her own kitchen in the middle of baking bread, or carrying the same weathered leather satchel she had used for decades. The two women had gradually settled into an easy rhythm. They no longer hesitated over who should do what. Eleanor naturally assumed responsibility whenever a birth became medically complicated, while Martha seemed to know instinctively how to keep the room itself from falling apart around the mother. At first, Eleanor believed this was simply the result of experience. As the weeks passed, she realized it was something much deeper. One windy October afternoon, the two women were called to the Miller farm, where a young woman named Hannah had entered labor with her third child. The birth itself progressed smoothly, and Eleanor quickly recognized there would be little need for medical intervention. While she quietly examined the mother, Martha stepped outside for only a few moments. When she returned, she gently asked Hannah's husband if he would mind fetching another bucket of water from the well. The young man looked confused. There is already plenty. I know, Martha replied kindly, but I'd still be grateful if you'd fetch another. He nodded and left without another word. Eleanor watched him disappear through the doorway before leaning closer. We don't actually need more water. Martha smiled faintly. No. Then why send him? Because he's about to faint. Eleanor glanced toward the door in surprise. He looked perfectly calm. He always does. You know him that well? I delivered him. The answer came so naturally that Eleanor almost laughed. Martha continued arranging clean cloths beside the bed. When his mother was having her fifth child, he stood exactly where he was standing just now. You remember that? I remember he turned white then too. A few minutes later, when Hannah's husband returned carrying the unnecessary bucket, his face had regained its color. Eleanor quietly smiled to herself. Martha had not sent him away because she needed help. She had sent him away because she knew he needed a few moments to recover his courage without anyone watching. It was the sort of decision no textbook would ever mention. Another lesson came only days later. A frightened young woman named Elsie began crying almost as soon as her contractions started. Eleanor assumed the pain had simply overwhelmed her, but before she could speak, Martha walked over and gently opened the bedroom window just a few inches. The cold autumn air drifted quietly inside. Almost immediately, Elsie's breathing steadied. After the baby had safely arrived, Eleanor asked Martha why she had done it. "The room was too crowded," Martha answered. "I noticed." "No." Martha shook her head gently. "I don't mean with people." She looked toward the open window. "Elsie's mother died in this room." Eleanor remained silent. "Every time the room becomes too warm," Martha continued softly, "she says it feels exactly like that day." "You knew?" "I've known since she was 6. Eleanor looked across the room, where the exhausted young mother now held her sleeping son. There had been no medical reason to open the window, only a human one. As autumn deepened, Eleanor found herself watching Martha more carefully during every visit. She noticed that Martha almost always greeted the oldest woman in the room before speaking to the mother herself. She noticed that Martha remembered the names of children who had died years earlier, mentioning them gently whenever it seemed right, never pretending they had been forgotten, simply because another baby was about to be born. She noticed that Martha knew exactly which grandmother ought to remain beside the bed and which one should be given a practical task outside before her own anxiety unsettled everyone else. Some husbands were told to keep the fire burning. Others were asked to fetch water. One nervous uncle was instructed to sharpen knives in the shed, not because anyone needed sharp knives, but because Martha recognized that the poor man desperately needed something useful to do with his shaking hands. One evening, while walking home together beneath a sky already bright with early stars, Eleanor finally spoke the thought that had been growing quietly inside her for weeks. "Bath taught me how to deliver babies." Martha looked sideways at her. "I imagine it did. But Low Thorpe is teaching me something else." "What is that?" Eleanor smiled. "That babies are only part of the room." Martha laughed softly. She adjusted the lantern she carried. "The baby always gets the attention. And the mother gets ours." They walked another few steps before Martha added, "Childbirth isn't only about bringing someone into the world. No, it's about helping everyone else stay steady while it happens." The words lingered in Eleanor's thoughts long after they reached the church gate. That night, she sat beside her kitchen fire with a medical textbook open across her lap. It was one she had studied countless times during her younger years, filled with detailed illustrations and careful explanations of difficult deliveries, dangerous complications, and proper procedures. She turned page after page. There were diagrams of the human body, instructions for emergencies, descriptions of illnesses. Everything was precise. Everything was useful. Yet nowhere could she find a chapter explaining how to recognize the husband who needed sending outside before fear overcame him. Nowhere did it mention opening a window because grief remembered warmth. Nowhere did it explain that sometimes the most important person in the room was neither the mother nor the baby, but the grandmother quietly crying in the corner because she remembered another birth many years before. Eleanor closed the book gently. For most of her life, she had believed she had come to Low Thorpe carrying knowledge that the village lacked. Now, for the first time, she wondered whether the opposite might also be true. Perhaps there were lessons no city could ever teach. Perhaps wisdom, like wild herbs growing between old stones, sometimes flourished best in places where no one thought to cultivate it. And as she blew out the lamp before going to bed, Eleanor realized she no longer thought of Martha Greaves as the woman whose trust she hoped to earn. She had quietly become something much rarer, a teacher Eleanor had never expected to find. By the middle of November, Eleanor's little blue notebook had begun to grow heavier once again. Not because the book itself had changed, but because its empty pages were no longer empty. One by one, new names had quietly appeared beneath the old ones from Bath. Children born in Low Thorpe now filled the latter half of the notebook, their stories written in the same careful hand that had once recorded births in elegant townhouses overlooking the Georgian crescents. Yet, although the places had changed completely, Eleanor's habit had not. Beneath every child's name, she still noted the weather, the flowers growing outside the window, and the first words spoken by the mother after hearing her baby's cry. Sometimes it was something simple, "It's over." Sometimes it was joyful, "Look at her little fingers." And once, after a particularly long labor, a mother had simply whispered, "Tell my husband he may stop worrying now." Eleanor smiled every time she remembered that one. She often wondered whether anyone besides herself would ever read those pages. Perhaps not, but she believed that some moments deserved to exist somewhere beyond memory alone. One damp afternoon, rain settled steadily across the village, making travel almost impossible. No babies seemed in any hurry to arrive that day, and for the first time in several weeks, Eleanor found herself with an unexpected afternoon of quiet. She sat beside the kitchen window, updating the notebook after visiting two mothers earlier that morning. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, while rain traced slow patterns across the glass. Every few moments, Eleanor paused to think before adding another line beneath a child's name. The first frost covered the fields. The grandmother laughed louder than the baby cried. 3 robins sat upon the garden fence. She had just finished writing when another knock sounded at the door. It was Martha. "You've tea?" the older woman asked. "I always have tea." "Good." Martha removed her damp cloak, warmed her hands beside the fire, and settled into the chair opposite Eleanor without ceremony. Their visits had gradually become more frequent during the autumn. Neither woman had ever suggested friendship aloud, yet they now found themselves dropping by one another's cottages for reasons that rarely required explanation. For several minutes they spoke only of ordinary things: the weather, the Turner family's new calf, the church roof that still leaked whenever heavy rain came from the west. Eventually Martha's eyes drifted toward the blue notebook lying open upon the table. "You always carry that thing." "I do. I've noticed." Eleanor smiled. "It has traveled rather a long way." Martha leaned forward slightly. "I've wondered." She hesitated. "What exactly you keep writing in there?" Eleanor looked down at the familiar pages. "My memories." Martha frowned. "Memories? Of the births? I thought it'd be medical notes. There are some. And the rest?" Eleanor gently turned the notebook around so Martha could see. "Have a look." Martha reached toward the book, almost cautiously. She had expected lists, perhaps instructions, maybe observations about difficult deliveries. Instead, the first page she opened contained only a child's name, the date of birth, and beneath it, 4 short lines: "Heavy rain all afternoon. 1 white rose still blooming beside the front gate. The baby wrapped in her grandmother's wedding shawl. The mother laughed before she slept." And Martha turned another page, then another. There were no criticisms, no judgments, no comments about mistakes anyone had made. Every page looked strangely gentle. Names, weather, flowers, little fragments of ordinary life. She continued reading, The church bell rang just as the baby arrived. The father forgot to remove his muddy boots. A blackbird sang outside the bedroom window. The older sister insisted on holding the baby first. Finally, Martha closed the notebook halfway. I don't understand. What don't you understand? Why write all this? Eleanor looked at the worn blue cover before answering. Because mothers forget. Martha frowned slightly. They don't forget having a baby. No, they never do. It's everything around it. Eleanor spoke quietly, almost as though thinking aloud. After a difficult birth, people usually remember only the pain or the relief. The little things disappear first. She gently touched one of the pages. The weather, the flowers, the way sunlight fell across the blanket, the first thing the mother said, the first thing the father did. They're all gone before long. Martha remained silent, so I remember them instead. The older woman slowly opened the notebook again. This time, she noticed something she had missed before. Every child's page ended the same way. Not with Eleanor's signature, not with medical observations, but with one small sentence that belonged entirely to that family. Her grandfather cried before anyone else. He arrived just before the harvest. She opened her eyes when the church choir began singing. It was as though every child had been welcomed, not only into the world, but into a story. Martha looked up. You've done this for all of them? For nearly 30 years. Even in Bath, every single one. Martha gently turned another page, then another. Finally, she asked, almost in a whisper, do their families know? Most don't. Why not tell them? Eleanor smiled. I never wrote them for the parents. No, I wrote them for the children. Martha looked puzzled. The children. One day they'll grow up. Eleanor's voice softened. They may wonder what the world looked like on the day they were born. She paused. I wanted someone to remember. The rain outside had almost stopped. Only the occasional drop still fell from the church roof into the puddles below. For a long while, Martha said nothing at all. She simply sat, turning pages slowly, her rough fingertips moving carefully across Eleanor's neat handwriting. Then she stopped suddenly. What made you write flowers? Eleanor smiled. My own mother. How so? When I was little, she used to tell me that every season had flowers waiting for someone to notice them. She laughed softly. When I became a midwife, I realized babies rarely noticed flowers, so you noticed them for them. Exactly. Martha closed the notebook very gently and rested both hands upon it. I thought, she hesitated. I truly thought this was where you kept notes about everything we'd done wrong. Eleanor looked surprised. Why would I do that? Martha gave a small shrug. You came from Bath. And? You were educated. Another pause. I thought perhaps educated people always kept records. We do. Martha looked at the notebook. But yours aren't about mistakes. No. What are they about? Eleanor looked toward the rain-washed churchyard outside the window. They're about beginnings. Martha remained unusually quiet as she prepared to leave. At the doorway, she paused, one hand resting upon the old wooden latch. Do you know something? What is it? In 40 years, she searched for the words. I've helped bring more babies into the world than I could ever count. I'm sure you have. But until today, her eyes returned briefly to the notebook still resting on Eleanor's table. I never thought anyone might be worth remembering, besides the baby. Eleanor smiled gently. I've always believed the mother deserves remembering too. Martha nodded. So does the father. Yes. The grandmother. Yes. The rain. If it rained. A faint smile appeared on Martha's weathered face. And the flowers, especially the flowers. The older woman laughed quietly before stepping out into the cool afternoon. Eleanor watched from the window as Martha walked slowly along the muddy lane toward her own cottage. She noticed something different in the older woman's stride. It was not lighter, not happier, only slower, as though she were carrying home a thought too precious to hurry. That evening, while preparing supper, Martha stopped beside the faded family Bible that rested upon her kitchen shelf. Inside its worn pages were the names of nearly every child she had helped deliver during 40 years in Low Thorpe. There was just enough empty space beside the newest name. After staring at it for a long moment, Martha picked up a pencil. Carefully, in clumsy letters she had never truly learned to form, she added 4 simple words. Snow fell before dawn. It was the first note she had ever written about a birth that was not simply a name. And though she would never admit it aloud, it was Eleanor Voss who had taught her that some memories deserved to live a little longer than people expected. Winter announced itself almost without warning. One afternoon, the fields beyond Low Thorpe still carried the dull gold of late autumn. By the following morning, they had disappeared beneath a blanket of snow that seemed to have fallen silently through the entire night. The dry stone walls that divided the farms became white ridges stretching across the countryside, while the familiar lanes vanished beneath deep drifts that made every journey uncertain. The village grew quieter than Eleanor had ever known it. Doors opened less often. Smoke lingered low above the rooftops because the wind no longer carried it away. Even the church bell sounded softer, as though the snow itself had wrapped the whole valley in wool. Reverend Ashcroft stopped by Eleanor's cottage one morning, carrying a sack of coal over one shoulder. "The road to Hatherley has closed," he said, as he stamped the snow from his boots. "The bridge, completely buried. And the doctor?" Samuel gave a small shake of his head. "I shouldn't expect anyone from the town until the weather changes." Eleanor looked toward the window, where thick flakes continued falling without pause. "Let's hope no babies choose this week," Samuel smiled. "They rarely ask our permission." For nearly 5 days the snow continued. Farmers dug narrow paths between cottages. Children disappeared almost entirely indoors. The few wagons that attempted to leave the village returned before sunset, defeated by roads that no longer resembled roads at all. Every evening, Eleanor checked her leather case before going to bed. Fresh linen, clean instruments, bandages, her notebook. Everything waited beside the front door, exactly as it always had. Experience had taught her that babies paid very little attention to the weather. If anything, they seemed unusually fond of arriving when help was hardest to reach. The knock came well after midnight, not a polite knock, not even an urgent one. It was the desperate pounding of someone who had forgotten every rule of courtesy. Before Eleanor had fully risen from bed, she already knew what it meant. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, lit the lamp beside the door, and opened it. A young man stood outside, almost buried beneath snow. His coat was white from the storm, his hair frozen with ice, and every breath escaped him in hurried clouds. "Mrs. Voss." He struggled to catch his breath. "My wife." Another breath. "The baby." Eleanor had already reached for her cloak. "How long?" "Since yesterday evening." "Her first child?" "No, the second." She nodded once. "Where is Martha?" "I've sent my eldest boy." Eleanor closed her leather case. "Then let's hope he finds her." The wind struck like a living thing the moment they stepped outside. Snow swirled across the lane so thickly that the church almost disappeared only a few yards away. Their lantern cast a small circle of golden light that seemed immediately swallowed by the darkness beyond it. Walking became slow and difficult. Each step disappeared almost as soon as it was made. The young farmer apologized repeatedly for bringing Eleanor out in such weather. She answered the same way every time. "You did exactly the right thing." Nothing more needed saying. The storm itself filled every silence. They had walked scarcely halfway through the village when another lantern appeared ahead, moving steadily through the white darkness. Its light rose, disappeared, then rose again as someone climbed through the deep snow. The figure drew nearer until Eleanor recognized the familiar heavy boots and thick wool shawl. Martha. She carried an old storm lantern in one hand and a weathered satchel in the other. Neither woman appeared surprised to see the other. "So," Martha called above the wind, "you got the message too? My boy found you?" "He did." Martha glanced toward Eleanor's leather case. "You've everything?" "As always." "So have I." That was all. There was no discussion about who should lead. No awkward politeness. No suggestion that one of them ought to stay behind. Without another word, the two women simply turned together and continued following the young farmer toward the isolated cottage, waiting somewhere beyond the storm. The farther they walked, the more difficult the journey became. Snow reached almost to their knees in places. The narrow footbridge crossing the stream had vanished completely beneath white drifts, forcing them to feel each step carefully with their boots before trusting the frozen boards beneath. Several times, the wind extinguished Martha's lantern. Each time Eleanor sheltered the flame beneath her cloak, while Martha patiently relit it without complaint. Neither woman hurried. They both understood that falling into the icy stream would help no one waiting ahead. As they climbed the final hill before the farm, Eleanor looked sideways toward Martha. "I've never seen weather quite like this." Martha smiled faintly beneath her scarf. "You weren't here 3 winters ago." "Worse?" "Oh, much. You still walked." "I always walked." Another pause. "So did you." Eleanor looked ahead into the snow. "Yes. I suppose women in our profession don't get to choose the weather." "No, we only choose whether we keep walking." Martha nodded quietly. "That's true." At last a dim light appeared through the storm. The farmhouse. Its windows glowed weakly against the darkness, while smoke fought desperately to escape the chimney before the wind tore it sideways across the roof. Even before reaching the door, Eleanor heard it. The low, exhausted cry of a woman whose labor had already lasted far too long. The sound stopped both women for the briefest moment, not from fear, from recognition. Each had heard that particular voice many times before. It was the voice that told experienced midwives something was wrong long before anyone spoke the words aloud. The young husband reached the door first. "They're here," he shouted into the house with obvious relief. Someone inside hurried to lift the latch. Warm air spilled briefly into the frozen night. Eleanor tightened her grip upon the leather case. Beside her, Martha quietly adjusted the lantern before handing it to the young farmer. "You'll need both hands free now," she said. Then she looked toward Eleanor. For a heartbeat, the two women stood silently beneath the falling snow. No introductions remained. No doubts remained. Only work. Martha gave one small nod. Eleanor returned it. Together, without another word, they crossed the threshold. Behind them, the wind continued howling across the empty fields. Inside, another life was waiting to enter the world. And without either woman ever speaking it aloud, something had quietly changed. Weeks earlier, they might have entered that cottage as two midwives, protecting two different ways of doing things. Tonight, neither carried pride, neither carried rivalry. Each carried only what the other did not. And when the door closed behind them, shutting out the storm, it no longer mattered which woman had come from Bath, or which had belonged to Low Thorpe all her life. What mattered was that one frightened mother now had both of them. The warmth inside the farmhouse came as a sudden contrast to the bitter cold outside, yet it was not a comforting warmth. The fire burned fiercely in the hearth, kettles hissed over the flames, candles flickered on every available surface, and the small cottage seemed crowded with anxious faces that had been waiting far too long. Fear has a way of making even the largest room feel too small, and this humble farmhouse, with its low ceiling and rough stone walls, seemed almost unable to contain the worry that had settled over everyone inside. The moment Eleanor stepped through the doorway, she understood why. The labor had gone on for many hours. Too many. The young mother, Sarah Wilcox, lay exhausted upon the narrow bed, her breathing shallow, her strength nearly spent. Damp strands of hair clung to her forehead, while every contraction left her weaker than the one before. Beside the bed stood her husband, his hands trembling despite every effort to appear calm. An elderly neighbor whispered prayers beneath her breath in one corner, while Sarah's own mother pressed a handkerchief tightly between her fingers, trying not to let her daughter see the fear in her face. Eleanor placed her leather case quietly upon the table and crossed the room without haste. Experience had taught her that people borrowed calm from the person who entered last. If she hurried, everyone else would hurry. If she appeared frightened, the room would become frightened with her. She knelt beside the bed and gently took Sarah's wrist. "My name is Eleanor," she said softly. "You've done wonderfully to bring your little one this far." Sarah opened tired eyes. "I can't." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "I don't have anything left." Eleanor did not answer immediately. Instead, she rested one reassuring hand over Sarah's own and waited until another contraction had passed. "You still have enough." "I don't." "You do." Sarah shook her head weakly. "I've been trying all night." "I know. I think I've failed." Eleanor smiled, with the quiet certainty that only long years could bring. A mother who is still trying has not failed. While Eleanor spoke with Sarah, Martha moved silently through the room. She asked someone to stir the fire. Another woman was sent to warm more blankets. She gently guided Sarah's frightened mother into the chair nearest the bed, where her daughter could see her face without having to search for it between contractions. Finally, Martha turned toward Sarah's husband, Thomas. The young man looked up immediately. "I need you. What shall I do?" "Sit." He blinked. "Sit? Beside your wife." Without another word, he obeyed. Martha took his rough, shaking hand and placed it gently into Sarah's. "Don't say anything clever," she murmured. "Just don't let go." The young man nodded, unable to trust his own voice. Eleanor noticed the exchange with quiet admiration. She herself might have focused first upon the birth. Martha had focused first upon the family. Both mattered. When Eleanor finally examined Sarah more carefully, her expression grew thoughtful. The baby had not descended properly. Its position was wrong. Not hopelessly wrong, but wrong enough that the birth would not resolve itself without help. She drew a slow breath before looking toward Martha. "Our little traveler has decided to arrive backwards." Martha met her eyes immediately. "Breech?" Eleanor gave the smallest nod. Neither woman spoke another word for several moments. There was no need. Both understood exactly what such a delivery could become if fear overtook the room before they themselves did. Outside, the storm continued to hurl snow against the windows. Even if someone had attempted the impossible journey to the nearest town, no physician could have reached Low Thorpe before morning. Whatever happened next would happen here. Eleanor washed her hands once more before kneeling beside the bed. She leaned close enough that Sarah did not have to strain to hear. "I need you to listen only to my voice." Sarah nodded faintly. "There will be moments when you feel you cannot continue." Another nod. "When those moments come," Eleanor smiled, "borrow my courage until yours comes back." Tears gathered quietly in Sarah's eyes. "What if it doesn't?" "It always does." "How can you know?" "Because I've seen it." She gently brushed damp hair away from Sarah's forehead. Again and again. The next hour passed with agonizing slowness. Eleanor worked patiently, carefully guiding the difficult delivery with the confidence earned through nearly 3 decades beside birthing beds. Every movement demanded precision. Every decision required patience. There could be no rushing, no panic, no wasted motion. Yet even as Eleanor concentrated upon the child, she became increasingly aware that another struggle was unfolding beside her. Sarah herself was beginning to lose heart. Each contraction left her weaker. Her breathing became uneven. Twice she whispered that she wanted to sleep. Once she quietly asked whether the baby was already gone. Eleanor recognized the danger immediately. A body could sometimes continue after hope had quietly stopped. Before Eleanor could answer, Martha moved to the head of the bed and gently smoothed Sarah's hair, exactly as a mother might comfort a frightened child.
"Do you remember your grandmother's kitchen?" Martha asked unexpectedly. Sarah looked confused. "What? The old farmhouse?"
Another contraction came. Sarah cried out. When it passed, Martha continued speaking as though they were simply sharing memories by the fire. The blue cupboard, a faint flicker, crossed Sarah's exhausted face. Yes, and the plum tree. My grandfather planted it. He did. Martha smiled softly. I was there the day your mother was born. Sarah blinked slowly. You were? I was younger than you are now. Another contraction began. Martha tightened her grip gently. And, do you remember what your grandmother always said? Sarah closed her eyes. No, the women of this family are stronger than they believe. The room fell strangely quiet. Even Sarah's mother looked up in surprise. I remember hearing those words, when your grandmother helped your own mother bring you into this world. Martha's voice never rose. It remained steady, familiar, comforting. As your mother heard them, she squeezed Sarah's hand gently, and as your grandmother heard them before her. Another pause. Now it's your turn. Sarah's breathing slowly steadied, not because the pain had lessened, it had not, but because she no longer felt she was enduring it alone. Eleanor glanced toward Martha only once. It was enough. In that brief exchange, each woman understood what the other was doing. Eleanor was guiding the child safely into the world. Martha was quietly guiding the mother toward believing she still could. Neither task could succeed without the other. For the first time since arriving in Low Thorpe, Eleanor understood something with absolute clarity. No medical school had ever taught her how to remind a frightened woman that she belonged to generations of mothers who had already survived what she feared. No textbook had explained that courage sometimes arrived disguised as an old family memory. That wisdom belonged entirely to Martha, and tonight it was every bit as necessary as Eleanor's own hands. Outside, the wind still roared across the frozen fields, but inside the little farmhouse, another kind of storm had begun to calm. Sarah drew one long, steady breath, then another. Finally, she looked directly at Eleanor. I'm ready. Eleanor smiled warmly. I know. For the first time that long night, both women believed it. The baby's first cry came so suddenly that for a brief moment, no one in the room seemed to believe they had truly heard it. It was not a loud cry, nor a particularly dramatic one. It began as a small, uncertain sound, before gathering strength with each passing breath, until it filled the little farmhouse with a kind of music no one there would ever forget. Outside, the winter storm still drove snow against the windows with relentless force, but inside the room, every other sound seemed to disappear beneath the simple reassurance that a new life had arrived safely. Eleanor remained exactly where she was for another few moments. Experience had taught her that a birth did not end with the baby's first breath. There were still 100 small things requiring careful attention before anyone could truly relax. She wrapped the child in warmed blankets, examined the tiny hands and feet with practiced gentleness, then placed the baby carefully into Sarah's waiting arms. The young mother looked down in complete silence. Only minutes earlier she had believed she might never see her child. Now she simply watched the little face resting against her chest, tears slipping quietly across cheeks too exhausted even to smile. Her husband knelt beside the bed and rested one trembling hand upon his wife's shoulder. Neither of them spoke. Some moments were too full for words, and this was one of them. Around the room, the tension that had held everyone so tightly throughout the night slowly began to loosen. Sarah's mother covered her face and wept without embarrassment. The elderly neighbor, who had spent hours whispering prayers, quietly thanked God before turning to place another log upon the fire. Someone put fresh water on to boil. Another began folding away the linen that was no longer needed. The room did not erupt into celebration. It simply breathed again. Eleanor quietly washed her hands in a basin beside the window, while Martha moved through the room with the familiar confidence of someone who knew exactly what every family needed after a difficult birth. She reminded Sarah to rest before trying to speak too much. She persuaded the young father to eat the slice of bread someone had placed untouched upon the table hours earlier. She gently instructed the neighbors to leave before sunrise, so the new parents could have a few hours of peace. Watching her, Eleanor found herself smiling. There was nothing hurried in Martha's movements, nothing theatrical. She seemed to possess an extraordinary ability to restore ordinary life after extraordinary moments. Within half an hour, the farmhouse no longer felt like a place where tragedy had almost occurred. It felt once again like a family home that simply happened to contain one more child than it had the evening before. That, Eleanor realized, was another skill she herself had never fully mastered. She knew how to guide people through danger. Martha knew how to guide them gently back into everyday life. By the time the eastern sky had begun to pale behind the falling snow, the storm itself had finally started to weaken. The wind no longer roared across the fields with the same violence, and the snowflakes drifted more slowly past the window, as though even the weather had grown tired after such a long night. Eleanor packed her instruments carefully back into the leather case. Before closing it, she reached for her familiar blue notebook. She wrote only a few lines. Sarah Wilcox. A winter storm before dawn. The snow covered every road into the village. Then she paused. Finally, she added one last sentence. The child arrived because two women carried different kinds of wisdom into the same room. She looked at the words for a long moment before gently closing the notebook. It was the first time she had ever written about another midwife. She suspected it would not be the last. When at last the time came to leave, the family insisted upon walking Eleanor and Martha to the front door, despite their protests. Thomas shook Eleanor's hand with both of his own. I don't know how we'll ever thank you. Eleanor smiled. You already have. I haven't done anything. You trusted us. He looked down, uncertain whether that was enough. For Eleanor, it was. Sarah, still resting in bed, with her daughter sleeping peacefully beside her, lifted one tired hand in farewell. Please, she whispered, when she's older. Eleanor stepped closer. Yes? Tell her. Sarah glanced toward the tiny bundle lying against her arm. Tell her she was born on the night the whole village refused to let her arrive alone. I will. The journey back to Low Thorpe felt strangely different from the journey there. The snow still lay deep upon the fields. The lanes remained difficult to cross. The cold had not lessened, and yet neither woman noticed the weather quite as much as before. Perhaps relief had a way of making burdens lighter. Perhaps companionship did. For much of the walk they said nothing. The silence between them no longer felt cautious. It felt comfortable. As they reached the churchyard, Martha finally stopped walking. The first light of morning had begun to touch the roofs of the cottages. turning the untouched snow a pale shade of gold. She stood looking across the quiet village for several moments before speaking. "I've been thinking." Eleanor waited. "If I'd gone there alone tonight." Martha's eyes remained fixed upon the fields beyond the church. "I don't believe I could have saved them," Eleanor answered gently. "You don't know that. I do." She turned at last to face Eleanor. "I've delivered hundreds of babies. I'm sure you have, but not that one." Her voice remained calm. There was no sadness in it, only honesty. "I would have lost them." The words settled quietly between the two women. Then Martha did something Eleanor had never expected. She reached out and took Eleanor's gloved hands in both of her own rough, weathered ones. "They're alive." She paused. "Because you came." Eleanor felt an unexpected tightness in her throat. "You kept Sarah brave enough for me to do my work." Martha shook her head. "No, we both know that wasn't enough." Another long silence followed. Then, with the simplicity that seemed to shape everything Martha said, she added, "I spent weeks wondering whether there was still a place for me if you stayed." She smiled faintly. "Turns out there wasn't." Eleanor looked at her in surprise. Martha's smile grew a little warmer. There was a place for both of us. For a moment, neither woman moved. The rising sun slowly illuminated the church tower behind them, while the first smoke of morning curled from the chimneys of Low Thorpe. It was an ordinary winter dawn, yet something extraordinary had quietly ended. Not the storm, not the winter, but the invisible distance that had existed between two women ever since Eleanor first stepped into the village. Over the following days, no one in Low Thorpe spoke directly about that long winter night. Villages rarely did. Instead, strange little things began appearing outside Eleanor's cottage. One morning, she found a still warm loaf of bread wrapped carefully in linen. The next day, there was a small jar of apple preserve sitting upon the doorstep. A few evenings later, someone left a basket of fresh eggs beside the gate, followed by a neatly folded wool blanket, a bundle of dry firewood, and, one snowy afternoon, a small pot of honey with no note explaining who had brought it. Whenever Eleanor asked Reverend Ashcroft whether he knew who was responsible, he simply smiled. "You could ask. I have. And they all say they know nothing." Samuel laughed softly. "Then I imagine you'll never discover the truth." Eleanor smiled as she carried the basket indoors. She realized she did not need to know who had left each gift. She already understood what they meant. In Bath, gratitude had often arrived written in elegant letters sealed with colored wax. In Low Thorpe, it arrived quietly before sunrise, wrapped in brown paper, still warm from someone's oven, and left without a single word upon a neighbor's doorstep. Winter gradually loosened its hold upon Low Thorpe, though it did so reluctantly. The deep snow that had buried the village lanes for weeks began to soften beneath pale afternoon sunshine, and narrow streams of meltwater found their way along the edges of the stone walls before disappearing into the fields below. Sums all signed. One by one, the familiar sounds of village life returned. Farmers repaired broken fences that had bowed beneath the weight of the snow. Children ventured outdoors again, leaving crooked footprints across the muddy commons. Smoke still rose from every chimney, but now it drifted upward into brighter skies instead of disappearing into storm clouds. Inside Eleanor's cottage, life had settled into a rhythm that felt remarkably different from the lonely weeks after her arrival. The small waiting room beside the kitchen rarely stood empty for very long. Expectant mothers now came not only when labor had begun, but weeks beforehand, seeking advice about the months ahead. Young wives stopped by carrying babies wrapped in thick wool blankets, simply to ask whether a cough sounded troublesome or whether a restless child might be cutting another tooth. Sometimes they stayed only a few minutes. Sometimes they remained for an hour over tea. Eleanor no longer measured her days by whether someone knocked upon her door. She measured them by how many people forgot they had once hesitated to do so. Martha came often as well. Sometimes she arrived because a mother needed both of them. Sometimes because she wished to borrow dried herbs. Sometimes for no reason at all beyond sharing a pot of tea before walking home again. Neither woman ever mentioned the winter storm. Neither needed to. The friendship born that night required no further explanation. One clear morning, near the beginning of March, while Eleanor was hanging freshly washed linen in the garden behind her cottage, she noticed a young woman waiting quietly beside the gate. The girl could not have been more than 18 years old. She wore a plain brown coat, several sizes too large for her slender frame, and her hands remained tightly clasped together, as though she had spent the entire walk rehearsing what she wished to say. Eleanor smiled warmly. "You needn't wait out there. Please come in." The young woman stepped through the gate, but continued looking rather nervous. "My name is Clara. It's lovely to meet you, Clara. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all." Once they had settled inside, with tea warming gently between them, Eleanor noticed that Clara's eyes kept drifting toward the leather case resting beside the fireplace. Finally, the young woman gathered enough courage to speak. "I've come to ask something rather unusual." "In my experience," Eleanor replied with a gentle smile, "those are often the most interesting questions." Clara laughed quietly. "I should like to become a midwife." The words filled the room with a pleasant stillness. For several moments, Eleanor simply looked at the young woman across the table. Not because she was surprised, but because she realized no one had ever asked her that question before. During 28 years in Bath, she had trained nurses, advised young physicians, and occasionally allowed students to observe difficult deliveries. Yet no one had ever asked simply to learn her life's work. "What made you decide that?" Eleanor asked. Clara lowered her eyes briefly before answering. "When my sister gave birth last autumn," she smiled, "I watched you, and you never hurried." Another pause. "You made everyone else believe everything would be all right." Eleanor felt unexpectedly touched. "I wasn't always certain it would." "I know." Clara smiled. "But everyone else believed you." Before Eleanor could reply, another familiar knock sounded at the front door. Without waiting for an invitation, Martha stepped inside, carrying a basket covered with clean linen. "I've brought back your blankets." She stopped mid-sentence upon noticing Clara. "Oh." The young woman rose politely. "Good morning, Mrs. Greaves." "Morning." Martha looked from Clara to Eleanor with quiet curiosity. "Have I interrupted something?" "Not at all," Eleanor replied. "Clara was just telling me she'd like to become a midwife." Martha's weathered face softened immediately. "Would you now?" Clara nodded. "If you'll have me." The older woman placed her basket upon the table. "Well," she smiled, "that'll save the village looking for one in another 40 years. Everyone laughed. The room suddenly felt wonderfully light. After another cup of tea, Eleanor turned toward Clara. "If you're willing to work hard, I am. I'd be happy to teach you." Clara's face brightened with relief. But before Eleanor could continue, the young woman glanced hesitantly toward Martha. "There is one more thing." "What is it?" Martha asked. Clara looked from one woman to the other. "I don't wish to learn from only one of you." Silence settled gently across the room. Eleanor assumed, for the briefest moment, that Clara was simply trying to avoid causing offense. Then the young woman continued. "I want to learn Mrs. Voss's hands." She looked toward Eleanor, the way she always seems to know exactly what to do. Then she turned toward Martha. "But I also want to learn how you know people." Martha frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Clara smiled. "You seem to understand what a mother is afraid of before she says a single word. She hesitated before adding, "I've watched you both." When Mrs. Voss enters a room, she looked toward Eleanor again. Everyone feels safer because she knows what to do. And when you enter, she looked back at Martha. Everyone feels safer because they know you already understand them. The room remained quiet. No one had expected that answer. Certainly not Eleanor. She had imagined the girl would choose one teacher. Martha had almost certainly imagined the same. Instead, Clara had quietly refused the choice altogether. "I don't think," she said softly, "that the village should lose either way of caring for people." For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Then, quite unexpectedly, Martha began to laugh. It was not loud laughter, nor mocking laughter. It was the warm, surprised laughter of someone who had spent months worrying about the wrong question. Eleanor joined her a moment later. "I believe," she said, still smiling, "that Clara may be wiser than both of us." "I was just thinking exactly the same thing," Martha replied. The older woman reached into her basket and removed a folded white cloth. She handed it to Clara. "This," she said, "is the first thing every midwife ought to learn." Clara unfolded it carefully. "It looks like an ordinary towel." "It is," Martha smiled. "Now fold it again." The young woman obeyed. Martha watched patiently before gently shaking her head. "Not like that." She took the cloth and demonstrated another way. When a frightened mother reaches for it with shaking hands, she shouldn't have to search for the corner. Clara nodded thoughtfully. A moment later, Eleanor quietly opened one of her drawers and removed another folded cloth. "It can also be done this way," she said. "This fold makes it easier to unwrap quickly if the baby arrives sooner than expected." Clara looked from one cloth to the other. "They're different." "Yes," Eleanor replied. "They both work." Martha nodded. "So learn both." The young woman smiled. "I intend to." That afternoon marked the beginning of Clara's apprenticeship. Some days, she accompanied Eleanor, learning how to recognize difficult labors, how to keep careful notes, and how to prepare every instrument before it was needed. On other days, she walked beside Martha through muddy lanes and across frozen fields, discovering that every family carried its own history, every mother her own quiet fears, and every birth belonged not only to the child being born, but to the people gathered around the bed. Slowly she came to understand what neither woman had fully realized until they had met one another. Knowledge could be taught, experience could be shared, but wisdom grew strongest when different kinds of understanding learned to live side by side. And without anyone ever declaring it aloud, the oldest disagreement in Low Thorpe quietly came to an end. The future would not belong only to Eleanor's careful learning, nor only to Martha's lifelong intuition. It would belong to those who were humble enough to inherit both. By the time spring returned to Low Thorpe, it seemed to arrive almost shyly, as though uncertain whether winter had truly finished with the valley. The snow disappeared first from the church roof, then from the tops of the dry stone walls, and finally from the narrow lanes where children immediately returned to chasing one another through puddles left by the thaw. The fields beyond the village slowly exchanged their pale winter colors for fresh green, while clusters of primroses appeared beneath the hedgerows almost overnight, followed a few weeks later by bluebells that transformed the nearby woodland into a quiet sea of violet. To anyone passing through, Low Thorpe looked very much as it always had. The cottages remained low and weathered. The roads were still muddy after every rainfall. The nearest doctor was still far enough away that no one expected him to arrive quickly when trouble came. Nothing remarkable seemed to have changed, yet the people who lived there knew otherwise. The changes had happened indoors, in the small bedrooms where children first opened their eyes to the world, in kitchens where anxious fathers boiled water before dawn, and in cottages where frightened young mothers no longer faced the unknown, believing they were entirely alone. The village itself had scarcely changed. The lives within it had. Eleanor had now lived in Low Thorpe for almost a full year. Without ever noticing exactly when it happened, she had fallen into the rhythm of village life as naturally as though she had been born there herself. The morning still began with the church bell and the smell of fresh bread drifting across the churchyard. She still tended the little herb garden outside her cottage before breakfast, trimming lavender, gathering rosemary, and checking the first shoots of mint pushing through the warming earth. But there was one sound that had become as familiar to her as the church bell itself, the knock upon her front door. Sometimes it came before sunrise, sometimes after supper, sometimes twice in a single day. Not every visitor was expecting a child. Many came simply because they wished to ask a question before there was any cause for alarm. A young mother would stop by, wondering whether her baby was growing quickly enough. Another would ask whether she ought to rest more during the final weeks of pregnancy. Someone else might bring only a loaf of bread and stay long enough for tea before walking home again. The women of Low Thorpe no longer waited until fear forced them to seek help. They came long before fear had the chance to grow. Eleanor often thought that this, more than anything else, had changed the village. Not that she was called more often, but that she was called sooner. Martha's cottage remained just as busy as ever. If anything, the older woman's door seemed to stand open even more frequently than before. Young wives still sought her advice about families, neighbors, and the thousand small worries that never appeared in medical books. Children still wandered into her kitchen without knocking, certain they would find a biscuit waiting somewhere. Elderly villagers still stopped to ask after one another, often remaining for half an hour before remembering why they had come in the first place. The difference was that now, whenever a conversation turned toward pregnancy or childbirth, Martha no longer ended every sentence herself. Quite often she would simply smile and say, "We'd best ask Eleanor about that." And Eleanor, when questions arose about families, old stories, or customs that stretched back long before her arrival, answered just as naturally, "Martha will know." Neither woman seemed to notice they had begun speaking this way. The village noticed for them. Clara's apprenticeship had also quietly transformed the rhythm of their work. On fine mornings, she walked beside Eleanor, carrying the leather case that had once seemed almost too heavy for her slender arms. During the afternoons, she might be found helping Martha gather herbs from the hillsides or listening while the older woman recounted births that had taken place decades earlier, remembering names, faces, and family histories with astonishing precision. One evening, after returning from a straightforward delivery at a nearby farm, Clara asked the question that had been resting quietly in her thoughts for many weeks. "May I ask you both something?" They were sitting together outside Eleanor's cottage beneath the first apple blossoms of the season. Tea steamed gently from 3 well-worn cups, while swallows darted overhead through the fading light. "Of course," Eleanor replied. Clara looked thoughtfully from one woman to the other. "When did you stop disagreeing?" Martha laughed softly. "I don't think we ever truly disagreed. We didn't. We were simply afraid of different things." Eleanor nodded. "I was afraid the world no longer needed me. And I," Martha added, "was afraid it no longer needed what I'd spent my whole life learning." Clara considered this quietly. So who was right? The two older women exchanged a glance before smiling almost at the same moment. "Neither of us," Eleanor answered. "And both of us," Martha said. The 3 women laughed together, while somewhere beyond the churchyard, a blackbird began its evening song. One bright morning in early April, the church bell rang unexpectedly across the village. Its clear voice drifted over the fields, through open cottage windows, and across the lanes where farmers had already begun their day's work. People looked up almost instinctively. The bell did not sound hurried, nor mournful. It rang with a slow, joyful rhythm that everyone recognized immediately. Another child had been born, the first baby of spring. Within minutes, doors began opening all along the village street. Neighbors smiled knowingly to one another. Someone carried fresh bread toward the young family's cottage. Children ran ahead, hoping to be the first to hear whether the baby was a boy or a girl. It had become one of Low Thorpe's quiet traditions that whenever the first child of spring arrived safely, the church bell would ring once in celebration, not because the village had gained another pair of tiny hands, but because another family had safely crossed one of life's greatest thresholds. As Eleanor walked toward the church that morning, she paused beside the old stone wall overlooking the village. From there she could see almost every rooftop. Smoke rose lazily into the gentle spring air. Children's voices echoed from the schoolyard. Clara crossed the lane carrying her leather case. Martha stood outside her cottage speaking with two young mothers while laughing at something one of them had said. The sight filled Eleanor with a quiet contentment she had never expected to find again. Bath had given her recognition. It had filled nearly 3 decades of her life with meaningful work, respected colleagues, and grateful families. She would always cherish those years. But Low Thorpe had given her something she had not realized she had been longing for until she found it. It had given her a place where usefulness mattered more than reputation, where gratitude was left quietly on a doorstep before dawn, where friendship grew slowly enough to take root, and where every unexpected knock upon the front door still carried the simple, beautiful reminder that somewhere nearby, someone believed there was no better person to call than Eleanor Voss. As the church bell sounded once more across the valley, Eleanor turned toward the lane where Clara was already waiting with the familiar leather case in her hands. "Another baby?" Clara asked. Eleanor smiled. "I rather hope so." Then, side by side, with Martha soon joining them from across the village green, the 3 women walked together beneath the flowering hawthorn trees, following the sound of the bell toward another small cottage where a new beginning was quietly waiting to be welcomed into the world. Many years later, when strangers happened to pass through Low Thorpe and asked how many people lived in the little village, no one ever answered with a number first. Instead, someone would usually smile and say, "Enough to keep 2 midwives busy." Few visitors understood why that answer always made the villagers laugh so warmly. Only those who had lived there long enough knew that, for almost an entire generation, nearly every child in Low Thorpe had begun life with the quiet presence of 2 remarkable women. The parish register still rested inside the small vestry beside the church, its heavy pages growing thicker with every passing year. Whenever Reverend Ashcroft opened it to record another birth, visitors occasionally noticed something unusual. Next to almost every child's name appeared 2 different marks. The first was Eleanor Voss's elegant handwriting, steady and graceful, even as the years slowly silvered her hair. The second was Martha Greaves's familiar cross, drawn carefully because she had never learned to write her own name. No one in the village thought the 2 marks looked strange. To them, they belonged together. One represented knowledge, patiently gathered through study, experience, and careful observation. The other represented wisdom, collected across a lifetime, spent knowing every family, every sorrow, and every quiet joy that had ever passed through Low Thorpe. The children rarely asked why 2 women had signed beside their names. To them, it had always been that way. As the years passed, Clara gradually became the midwife everyone had quietly expected she would become. She carried Eleanor's old leather case, polished smooth by decades of faithful use. She also carried Martha's weathered storm lantern, whose glass had been replaced more than once, but whose handle still fit comfortably into her hand. Whenever someone asked where she had learned her profession, Clara never gave a simple answer. Instead, she would smile and say, "I had 2 teachers." If people asked which one had taught her more, she always laughed. That would be rather like asking whether a bird flies better with its left wing or its right. Even after Martha's hands became too stiff to attend every birth, she continued welcoming frightened mothers into her kitchen, listening to their worries over warm tea before sending them confidently down the lane to Eleanor or Clara. And when Eleanor's eyesight eventually made the tiny stitches of her notebook more difficult to see in the fading evening light, Clara quietly began writing beside her. At first, she copied only names and dates. Later, she added the weather, the flowers blooming outside the window, the color of the baby's blanket, the first words whispered by an exhausted mother. One evening, Eleanor noticed Clara pausing thoughtfully above the page before writing. A robin sang beneath the windowsill just before dawn. She smiled. "I don't remember mentioning the robin." "You didn't." Clara looked up. "I heard it." Eleanor gently closed the notebook. "Then you've understood." Long after both Eleanor and Martha had become part of the village's oldest stories, young parents still opened the blue notebook from time to time. Some searched for their own names, others searched for those of their children. Occasionally, a grown son or daughter would discover, for the first time, that it had snowed on the morning they were born, or that primroses had been blooming beside the cottage door, or that their father had laughed and cried in the very same minute. The entries were never long, only a few gentle lines, yet somehow they made every child feel as though the world had paused, if only briefly, to notice their arrival. On warm spring mornings, when the church bell rang to welcome another new life into the village, older residents sometimes smiled quietly to themselves. Not because they were remembering one particular birth, but because they were remembering 2 women who had taught Low Thorpe something it had never needed words to explain. One had arrived believing she must prove that old skills still had value. The other had feared that everything she had devoted her life to would be forgotten. In the end, neither fear came true. The village never chose between them. Instead, it discovered that the safest hands are often not the ones that work alone, but the ones that willingly reach for another pair when the moment requires it. And perhaps that is why, if you visit Low Thorpe today and happen to hear the church bell drifting gently across the fields on a bright spring morning, you may also hear an old saying that parents still repeat whenever a new baby is placed into waiting arms. Every child deserves steady hands, and every steady hand is made stronger by kindness. With that quiet thought resting gently in the heart of the village, another generation began its story, just as countless others had before it, welcomed not by pride, nor by tradition alone, but by people who had learned that the greatest care is never about proving whose way is better. It is simply about making certain that, when a new life arrives, someone is there to greet it with calm hands, an open heart, and the quiet assurance that it has always been expected. And so, as another quiet evening settles over Low Thorpe, the lamps glow softly behind cottage windows, the church bell falls silent until morning, and somewhere beyond the village, spring flowers continue blooming, exactly as they always have. Perhaps the greatest kindnesses are not the ones remembered by history, but the ones quietly repeated from one ordinary day to the next. A reassuring hand, a patient voice, a familiar face arriving just when it is needed most. As you leave Low Thorpe behind tonight, may you carry with you the same quiet peace that Eleanor and Martha found together, the gentle reminder that wisdom is never diminished when it is shared, and that the most meaningful lives are often measured not by recognition, but by the comfort they bring to others. Thank you for spending this peaceful evening here at Quiet Victorian Nights. If you enjoyed tonight's story, you are warmly invited to return for another gentle journey through the quiet corners of Victorian England, where every ordinary life holds a story worth remembering. Until then, sleep peacefully, dream gently, and may the night be kind to you. Good night.